This is the second part on male reproduction and the importance of taurine. Last time we looked at an animal model, but we'll look at some of the literature and what's happening around the world. There are some doctors or people in the medical field of reproductive health and stuff like that who are saying that if the current situation continues the way it is in a lot of the Western countries, where I would say processed food industry is very extremely high, people don't cook much. They either go out or buy processed food. Most people do not eat regular, normal food. They don't cook at home their meats. They don't basically purchase certain foods that have certain nutrient densities. They pretty much, a lot of people nowadays, unfortunately, buy far too much processed foods, in particular in North America, in Australasia, and many parts of Western and Northern Europe. Now, that differs slightly in Eastern Europe and Southern Europe to differing degrees, depending on rural and urban areas and stuff like that. But the processed food industry is unstoppable, and it's becoming worse in terms of going more plant-based and stuff like that. All these are increasing the circumstances where people are not getting sufficient important nutrients for reproduction and health. And this is why we're seeing this dramatic change in fertility in a number of these countries that has actually plummeted. They're talking about, some scientists are, it's sort of doomsday sort of predictions. I don't necessarily subscribe to them 100%, but it is concerning when some scientists come out and say that by 2060, some of these countries will no longer have sufficient population, male population and female population that have sufficient reproductive capacity. Now that's a concern, and we're talking about 40 odd years from now. That's one more generation. That is, 33 years of a generation, just slightly over one generation. That is exceptionally concerning in that regard. Let's just take a look at some of this information. So this is basically looking at sperm count fertility in men, a rocky road ahead. This is Science and Society, which is, looking at a lot of overview places like the UK, European Union and all that. Talk about overpopulation, crap like that. There's a lot of nonsense in this. Let's just make this very clear from the outset. When we look at Sertoli cells, the number and stuff like that, underlying factors and stuff like that, when you look at research, it's very much tied into taurine as well. Obviously, there's things like ejaculation. If you're constantly supposedly playing with yourself, your load is going to be much less. I think that's less of a problem. These are the sort of, since the 1930s, we've seen this steady decline. But that's also associated very closely with the steady decline in the quality of food as well. We know in the 1930s, there was a big introduction of seed oils and refined sugars, particularly because the Great Depression, seed oils were cheaper through the Great Depression, and through the war years as well. It was easier for the US military to transport with their K rations of Ansel Keys's recommendations. It was easier to transport oils and refined sugars to the troops around the world. So that just continued on after that. And the food industry got right behind it because there were big profits to be made. Seed oils and refined sugars are cheap to produce. And so combining them in products, you can create very cheap food, but very poor in nutrition, and including taurine. Basically next to nothing when it comes to taurine once you process a food. You can actually see this article goes through, if people want to look at some of the history, the declines that have happened and stuff like that. I'm not going to go through all this because there's, quite a few pages and quite a bit of material to go through. So, but that gives you an idea of sort of what we're seeing, these declines in fertility, just collapsing, by the mid-40s, you can kiss goodbye female fertility. Where in the past, women, even in their 50s, my grandmother was getting pregnant, so that's on mum's side. And she had about 10 kids. She lost 6 to infant mortality and 4 survived. In those days, there was a lot of infant mortality. This is why when people talk about the average life expectancy back then, it's nonsense. When you take out the infant mortality numbers, they're the people that did survive infant mortality and were 30 or older, that didn't die in warfare and stuff like that, in that older age bracket. The numbers look much better than today. Let me put it that way. Our averages are higher because of lower infant mortality. That's the reality. But also, there is far less now, reproductive levels are less than, just slightly over 1 in many countries, which means that there's, 1 child replacing 2 parents. So that continues, plus the fertility rates going down. We're going to see a collapse in populations in Western Europe, Northern Europe, parts of Southern Europe in to differing degrees. And, it's going to be a disaster for those countries. So no amount of productivity increases and stuff like that is going to mitigate any of that. That's the reality. There's a news looking at some new information. New study confirms a huge drop in men's sperm level. Here are all the facts, and they believe that most men will be infertile by 2060, especially if they're on a veganerized diet that practically has no taurine and other important nutrients, animal nutrients. They say sperm count in men from North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand declined by 50 to 60% between 73 and 2011, according to a new study from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Surprisingly, the study, which analyzes data on the sperm counts of 42,935 men, found no decline in sperm count in men from Asia, Africa, and South America, although there was limited data from these areas. That doesn't surprise me, because in a lot of these countries, these people are still eating real food. They're not eating, there's not as much processed food in Asia, in Africa. And most processed food is very recent. It's only been very recent. Even in Indonesia, I remember back in about 2006, 2007 and 8, there was very little processed food industry. And then all of a sudden you had this explosion of the middle class, which went from a couple of million in a population of over 200 million. There was just at that stage about 2 or 3 million in the middle class, and it exploded to well over 80 million within, well, let's say within less than a decade of time. By that stage, you had a rapid acceleration of food industry, processed food industry. We saw this massive introduction because people could afford junk now, soft drinks and all sorts of things, where before they couldn't. They prioritized real food and nutrition. But when food becomes very cheap and people's living standards go up, which they can afford processed foods, what happens is they buy it because it's promoted to them. It's promoted as a Western lifestyle. It's promoted as, being more civilized. All this sort of nonsense is promoted, that it's the middle class lifestyle. You don't have to cook. You don't have to go and have, do what the peasants did or the average person. You can just have all these little treats and live off these treats and, have a consumer type existence which you were denied in the past. And that's how it's promoted in these cultures. And when we see that, we see this decline happen. They're right at the beginning of this. So they're just the children that are being born now is the first generation of this. This is why they're not seeing these effects yet. Still, a lot of the families still are cooking at home, especially now with the crisis, and are still cooking at home. So the amount of exposure to processed foods isn't as severe as we've had. We've had multiple decades of exposure to processed foods, and that sort of explains why. And when you talk about processed foods, you're talking about micronutrient deficiencies. These populations still are eating relatively whole foods for most of it, with some processed foods on the side. So they're still having sufficient whole foods, which means that they're not basically in very poor state. And that's pretty much, these are longitudinal sort of, they talk about debates and stuff like that, about issues and stuff like that. But, like the previous one, it's again observational stuff and talking about. Now let's get into the crux. Temporal trends in sperm count, systemic review in males. So this was the actual study, and people can go away and look at this sort of study. I'm not going to look at it in this because that's not the focus of this video. So people can go away and look at these declines that have actually happened in different areas, and the severity of certain declines in different population groups and stuff like that, if they're interested. So I'll attach that as well. Now, this is sort of research that I like, traditional mechanistic research, which shows cause and effect. This is basically in Egypt. It was actually done by the zoology department. Obviously, it's a mouse study, but you can't actually, let's say, deliberately contaminate a human with aluminium chloride. Okay, you can't do that and affect their testes and stuff like that. But this is what they did to these rats. And this is the first study to evidence the taurine protects against pathological changes in the testicular tissue of aluminium-treated mice. Okay, so they basically, in addition, transmission electron microscopes that showed destruction of the Sertoli cell. Remember, I showed those, the decline that's happening in those. And I said how taurine's very much highly tight junctions, apoptotic cells, death, spermatogonia, and primary spermatocytes. Various types of abnormalities and spermatid morphology, so a change in the structure they noticed, accumulation of lipid droplets, and there's inflammation going in there and trying to fix the mess, production of the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and mitochondrial damage in Leydig cells. So basically, complete and utter stuff up of those. So taurine post-treatment dose 1 gram per kilogram. So basically, these are mega doses. So it would be equivalent for a 70 kilo human. We're talking about 154 pounds. We're talking about 70 grams. They had to give, diminished these changes and significantly reduced the number of affected tubules compared to the aluminium poisoned mice. So if you're a human and you were to sustain severe aluminium poisoning, mega dosing of taurine would be a very good option, So let's put it that way in that regard. And we can see basically, because they did say here, oops, stop, don't move, transmit electron microscope to basically look at exactly what is happening. It's 200 micrometers. So that's that one, the A and D. Sorry, the B and D. So you can see very much difference. There's a lot of damage here. No, that's normal, good structures. Here it's been ripped apart. And then basically, when we're looking at the F, there's the E, and that's the aluminium and taurine group, showing almost normal spermatogenesis. See here? This is practically normal. Take a look. With the top ones there, this is the control that hasn't been affected. And if we go back to here, the one that was actually treated, you can see, you know, there's the rounded structures, there's rounded structures, you know, there's a bit of these gaps that are a bit wider in a few points, but generally speaking, they're almost normal. That's important. That shows basically how important taurine is maintaining those structures. You know, because of the osmotic effect, that's really what it is in those fluids. I've been telling you about this osmotic effect for some time. I've been trying to ram it into your heads to understand the importance of homeostasis and importance of fluids. We've got a lot of fluids in our body. You know, the regulation of these fluids is so important, and taurine is at the heart of that regulation. You know, it's not just basically peripheral, whatever. It is at the heart, fundamental. Even cells, they're maintaining their proper structures and all that, require taurine. You know, the intra and extra, the intrafluids in the intra and extracellular fluids, those inside the cell and outside in the bloodstream and stuff like that, they need to be properly regulated. And the only thing that does this regulation is taurine. Extremely important. You know, you should tattoo on your head a stake just to remind you every day the importance of having a stake, having your taurine to basically maintain good cellular health. Actually, tattoo it on a vegan. They need it more than you. That knowledge. Anyway, I'm not going to go right through this because people can read it at their own leisurely time. Taurine deficiency in sperm causes Mo infertility, study finds. Okay, so basically sperms are highly specialized cells adapted to achieve a single goal: fertilize an egg. Ah, yes, swim fast, get there and do the job, do the business. Yes, those little boys. Ah, yes. Along the road to fertilization, sperm must embark on a lengthy journey to the female oviduct, avoiding several fatal stresses that occur when they pass through different physiological environments. However, the events that allow sperm to achieve fertilization under these conditions are only partially understood. Isn't it appalling that we only partially understand these things? Ah, the old days, the good old days, human experiments. Oh, apparently they've been done in the C19 period for the wrong reasons, not for the right reasons, to help humanity basically achieve better reproductive health. They're concerned about that ethically, but when it comes to giving millions or billions of people contraindicated interventions, no problem. Boys and girls, no problem. Jab them all to hell. In a study published by the FEBS journal, researchers at the University of Tsukuba and Cornell University, that's a Japanese university, and Cornell, obviously, everybody knows, the US university, report that they uncovered a cell volume regulator in sperm cells that plays a key role in maintaining their shape and fertility. Did you hear that? They found a key regulator that plays a critical role. I wonder what it is. Most of the cell's mass consists of water. Surprise, surprise. I guess I know what it is. And this water can determine a cell's volume. The membrane that surrounds each cell is leaky, so cells can take in or release excess water depending on how much water surrounds them, a phenomenon known as osmosis. This property is analogous to how a sponge behaves, like a sponge taking on too much water. Changes in water levels can drastically change the volume and eventually the shape of a cell. Yes, that can be a problem. Cells have sensor mechanisms that let them compensate for changes in their osmotic environment, says corresponding author Atsushi Asano, an assistant professor at the University of Tsukuba. Without these compensatory sensors, cells would experience excessive volume changes, leading to a ruptured membrane or other morphological problems. We can't have that. This type of sensor is fairly common in cells. Yes, we know, except if you're a vaginarized moron, which has very little, or a sad dieter who loves processed foods to the hilt. But we were surprised to find one of that play a significant role in the function of sperm cells. Previously, it was found that male mice lacking cysteine dioxygenesis CB are infertile. CDO is a protein known to make the amino acid taurine, which in turn is known to play a role in osmosis. As I say, it's an osmolyte. While these facts are not new, the precise role of CDO and taurine in fertilization have been a long-standing controversy, not with me, but with vagoons and vagoon academics. Yes, they have. Yes, because it's too harsh on their poor little souls to accept that they are wrong, that their misanthropic ideology and thinking is basically making the world infertile, plus the food industry. In the study, the researchers confirmed the male mice missing CDO are indeed more likely to be infertile compared to their healthy counterparts, over 10 times more likely, tenfold. The last time I saw an observation, this is not even, we're talking about here mechanism, cause, where basically it's 10 times difference. We see a completely different outcome and we can measure it. The other stuff is basically observational epidemiology, which the measurements can be, let's say, rubbery. There, 10 to 20 to 30 fold is thousands of orders of magnitude in observational, and we can infer causality. So I think we can infer that here as well. with over 10 times, tenfold. They also found taurine levels drop dramatically in the sperm cells of these mice. This suggested a clear link between the two defects, cause and effect. Fix the defect, fix the cause. But was a conundrum in these findings. Sperms are unable to make proteins, including CDO. How then were the sperms obtaining the taurine? Meat. What was so critical to their function? The team discovered that rather than making their own taurine, the sperm cells absorbed taurine while passing through the male genital tract. Isn't it fantastic, the body? So it wasn't in there, but once passing through the male genital tract to be ejaculated, I like to say that, it picks up taurine. Isn't it a wonderful thing? An absolutely wonderful thing, nature, the body. Oh. The absorption process looks to be an important survival strategy for sperm during fertilization, since mature sperm cannot produce proteins on their own. Co-author Ellie Ushiyama says, the findings convinced us that taurine was essential to the fertilization process. That means meat is essential for the fertilization, is essential. Humanity could have not existed. Tell the Vagoons they're talking S-H-I-T. We just don't want it to be affected by the AI at the moment. But we still had to figure out what exactly taurine was doing in sperm cells. Protecting them, I would say. The research keyed in on one telling clue, an unusual kink in the tail of the sperm. Told you it had to do with something with the tail. Great swimmers. Yep. Sperm cells in the CDO deficient mice were nearly twice as likely to have a wrongly angled tail. Well, there you go. No wonder they couldn't find their way to the egg. Yes. When placed in an environment like that of a uterus, strikingly, the defect disappeared when the sperm was supplied with extra taurine. They became great swimmers. Told you, it's basically, you know, they should be giving it to basically swimmers in the Olympic Games. They'll just swim faster, maybe. These observations, depending if they're swimming through a uterus anyway, let's move on before I say too much. These observations led the authors to conclude that by controlling osmosis, yes, which taurine does, taurine helped to maintain the right shape of sperms during fertilization. Come here, mama. Anyway, our findings show that the production of taurine by CDO in the male reproductive tract and its absorption by sperm are pivotal mechanisms for male fertility. Asado concludes, we believe that as sperm travels through different osmotic environments, the level of taurine inside the cell shifts to balance the changes in cell volume. This prevents excess changes in shape caused by an influx or efflux of water coming in, influx, water going out. So the osmotic balance, the intra and extracellular fluids, so to speak, allowing the sperm to successfully complete fertilization under difficult environmental conditions. Yes, some of those uteruses are very hard to get into. Yes, I know. It's been the story of my life. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, so there's another looking at the sort of information. And they were saying taurine deficiency could cause male infertility. Scientists claim to a lack of the vital amino acid deforms sperm. Taurine deficiency can affect obese people or those with gout or hypothyroidism. Yes. Another reason why taurine is very important for hypothyroidism as well. Lack of the amino acid could cause sperm to become deformed and infertile. Oh, surprise, surprise. Vegetarians and vegans could also be at risk as taurine comes from animal foods. Oh, surprise, bloody surprise. You know, yeah, obviously, Coachy, obviously, you know, I mean, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to understand that. You know, I mean, breast milk is one of the most, you know, yummy things as a baby you could get into. Let's not completely send the AI into spasms by saying any more, but pretty much, you know, what they're looking at is men who have taurine deficiency are more likely to become infertile according to new research. And they've even looked at, you know, because we looked at this other stuff before about the swimmers and stuff like that. You know, I mean, this is nonsense. Taurine found in meat, vegetables and pulses. Vegetables and pulses have bugger all. We're talking about minuscules, and the way they're processed, they basically have nothing. You know, you want quantities, you need to get it from meat or seafood, even better, which is slightly higher, or supplement. Yes. The reality is that if you're on a veganerized diet or a SAD diet deficient in taurine, you're going to have reproductive problems. If, on the other hand, you are a carny super male, consider yourself lucky. You will be basically having very good swimmers. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this part 2 of very important information on human reproduction and why we don't have one single, not even half or a quarter or a third or a, 10% multi-generational vegan society. Because without taurine, they wouldn't be able to reproduce. They'd be dead. And unfortunately, now that we're going on full plant-based kibble diets globally, we don't need basically, some sort of other conspiratorial sort of intervention to kill us all off. It's just going to happen because of the diet. Reproduction is just going to go plummet, and pretty much you can kiss the whole human race goodbye if that was to become endemic on the planet. So yes, eat your meat and keep your swimmers in a healthy state. Anyway, and that goes for women as well, their eggs and stuff like that. This goes for both, because those fluids, the osmotic pressures within sperms or within eggs are the same, ladies, as well. You don't get off, It's very important, taurine, for reproductive health for both sexes. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. See yous. And let me, before I go, eat your bloody meat.